Today, the United States projects the image of a stable, unified superpower. But looking back at its origins, the nation began as a fragile, fragmented experiment that constantly threatened to tear itself apart. By 1787, the initial Articles of Confederation had failed, leaving a weak central government unable to manage domestic disputes or a disjointed economy. The drafting of the Constitution was an act of desperation to hold the fractured states together. Forging a single nation meant connecting the industrial centers of the North with the agrarian, slave-holding plantations of the South, two distinct systems that relied on one another even as they grew politically distant. To survive this divide, early politicians relied on maintaining strict numerical equality in Congress. Survival meant neither side could ever gain a legislative majority. The entire federal system rested on keeping the number of free states and slave states perfectly tied. That delicate equilibrium relied on fixed boundaries, but the horizon held millions of square miles of resource-rich territory that many in the East viewed as the nation's rightful next step. The concept of manifest destiny took hold, a widespread conviction that American settlers were ordained to push their borders from the Atlantic shores all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The relentless drive to push westward fueled the country's physical growth. Yet adding new land to the map guaranteed the destruction of the exact political balance keeping the nation intact. Looking at this historic map, the scale of the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 is immediately apparent. It added over 800,000 square miles of territory, doubling the physical size of the United States overnight. Decades later, aggressive pushes into the Southwest led to the annexation of Texas and a victorious war with Mexico, resulting in a massive territorial cession that stretched the country's borders to California. This land was already inhabited. Clearing the continent for American settlement required the systemic displacement of hundreds of thousands of indigenous people. Through policies like the Indian Removal Act of 1830, the federal government violently marched entire Native American civilizations across the Mississippi River. Into this emptied space poured hundreds of thousands of pioneers, drawn by the Oregon Trail and the California Gold Rush, their migration accelerated by the rapid construction of railroads. Taking the territory required industry and military force. Determining whether those new lands would operate with free labor or enslaved labor would paralyze the federal government. Every time a new territory gained enough population to apply for statehood, Congress faced a crisis. Admitting a new state meant adding 2 new Senate seats, threatening the tie between North and South. For decades, politicians relied on a geographic patch. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 established a horizontal line across the map, legally separating northern free states from southern slave states. The sheer size and irregular shape of the land won from Mexico made a straight horizontal line impossible to enforce. The old geographic agreements collapsed. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act offered a new solution: popular sovereignty. Instead of federal mandates, the settlers moving into these territories would vote to legalize or ban slavery themselves. Partisans from both sides immediately flooded into the territories to manipulate the elections. Kansas quickly devolved into a localized civil war, defined by voter intimidation and brutal guerrilla violence. The violence soon targeted the South directly. In 1859, radical abolitionist John Brown raided a federal armory at Harper's Ferry, aiming to arm enslaved people and ignite a nationwide rebellion. The federal government could no longer mediate the dispute through legislation or geographic boundaries. The political system had completely broken down into physical combat. The breaking point arrived with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Fearing his platform would lead to abolition, Southern leaders lost all remaining trust in the federal balance. Before Lincoln even took office, South Carolina voted to secede. A wave of other Southern states quickly followed, physically splitting the geopolitical map in two. In April 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on the federal garrison at Fort Sumter. The political crisis was now an active civil war. Lincoln initially mobilized troops to suppress the rebellion and restore the national borders. As the conflict deepened, the objective expanded into the permanent destruction of the institution of slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation officially declared enslaved people in rebel territories to be free and authorized the recruitment of tens of thousands of black soldiers into the Union Army. A war fought to maintain a compromised map ended up forcing the United States to physically confront and purge the contradiction written into its founding documents. To secure victory, the Union Army initiated a strategy of total war. General William Tecumseh Sherman marched forces through the South with orders to destroy the Confederate economic infrastructure and their will to resist. Union forces burned cities, destroyed railroads, and laid waste to agricultural centers, culminating in the surrender of Robert E. Lee's army in the spring of 1865. In the aftermath, Congress passed 3 constitutional amendments. They outlawed slavery, granted citizenship to anyone born in the United States, and guaranteed voting rights regardless of race. For a brief period known as Reconstruction, occupying federal troops remained in the South to enforce these new laws and protect the rights of newly freed Black Americans. In 1877, a political compromise to settle a disputed presidential election resulted in the withdrawal of those federal troops. Without military enforcement, Black Americans were subjected to a century of oppressive Jim Crow laws and systemic disenfranchisement. Drawing a border from coast to coast was achieved through industry and military force. Actually fulfilling the equitable ideals promised in the nation's charter remains a continuous, unresolved struggle.